right. Hi, I hope everyone is well nourished, feeling well. When Jay invited me to help introduce Joan Dye Gussow, the biggest question I had was, how do you introduce someone who needs no introduction? So as it turns out, Urvashi Rangan and I are going to do this together. How do you introduce the matriarch of the Eat Locally, Think Globally movement, according to the New York Times? How do you introduce the person who coined the term nutritional ecology? How do you introduce the person who first connected the dots between food, nature, and our future, and even thought to weigh the calories in one strawberry with the energy it took to transport that strawberry from California to New York? You can read Joan's professional bio on the web, where you'll learn that she's a professor emeritus from Teachers College, where for more than 40 years she has inspired her students to think differently and to think critically about food and nutrition through a much-needed systems lens. Those students, many of whom are in this audience tonight, are continuing to make tremendous impacts across the globe, carrying Joan's baton, having tremendous ripple effects, and that is what a tremendous teacher looks like. Well, I didn't have the luxury of being in Joan's classroom, but still, like many of you, she's been my teacher. I've read her books, I've watched her presentations online, and I've decided that how I would like to introduce Joan Gussow is to give you 6 reasons why I admire, respect, and deeply appreciate her. The first, like any good scientist, she's a keen observer, and she brings us along on her journey of awakening. And I'll give you one short example that I'll paraphrase, page 163 from Growing, Older, A Chronicle of Death, Life, and Vegetables. The comma is really important. This is serious. One spring morning, when unusually I had a few minutes to lie in bed after I woke, I noticed suddenly that there was no bird chorus. I had no idea how long it had been gone, which is how it is when we self-absorbed humans change the sensory world around us. We are too busy to notice what used to be, and our children will never know what they missed. Number 2, she calls out the many emperors who have no clothes. She speaks truth to power. In the 1970s, she testified to Congress about advertising sugary cereals to children. She said it was wrong. And then when industry executives complained to her dean that she was acting irresponsibly, the dean of Teachers College said, "Have you not heard of academic freedom?" In my interview with Joan on Food Sleuth Radio in 2014, we talked about the dangerous loss of the freedom to speak at many of our land-grant colleges. Number 3, she calls us to action. In 2012, speaking at a Just Food conference, she encouraged her audience to raise doubts. By raising doubts, we become the sand in the gears of the exploitive industrial food system. In 2014, in my interview with her, she said, "You know, you don't want the world to end while you're lying around eating bonbons, reading a lighthearted novel. You want to be in the trenches. You want to be on the front lines." Number 4, she's honest. And so she wrecks a lot of dinner parties. I can relate to this. Maybe you can too. You know, you're having dinner with friends and they're ordering the farmed fish, and you say, "Oh, should we let them know about the risks of that? Or should we let them know that there's pesticide sprays and residues?" Number 5, she has a terrific sense of humor. In Growing, Older, she describes the photo she might use in her obituary. I hope it doesn't come anytime soon, Joan, but on that dark day, when Joan leaves this earth, a few days after that, be checking the New York Times. There will be a photo of Joan, young and radiant in Rome, with a glass of wine in one hand and a cigarette in the other, with the look of romance in her eyes, and under that photo, it will say, "Current photo not available." That's all Joan's humor. Number 6 and last. Well, last because I only have 5 minutes. She gives us hope. She knows not only how to feed the world, she knows how to nourish it. And I want to thank Joan for enlightening me, and I want to turn it over to Urvashi Rangan because I know she feels the same way.
Yeah. Thanks, Melinda. Oh. Could I have my first slide, please? Joan, don't be mad that I've done a PowerPoint. So I'm going to give a little personal introduction. It's all right. They'll get it up at some point, Joan. I'll just start. I'm going to give a little personal intro because Joan is just as impressive in her... can I do it? You shall do it. Thank you. So Joan is just as impressive in her personal life as she is in her professional life. And a few years ago, my friend and colleague, Leslie Hatfield, who's here in the back, asked me if I would like to go to Joan's house for brunch. And having known Joan over the years in professional settings, I jumped at the chance and was thrilled to go to her house for brunch. And since then, I've been going to Joan's house for brunch and breakfast pretty frequently every few months, and it's been amazing. So I wanted to show you all a picture of Joan's house, and that is the back of Joan's house on the left, just so you could get a little sense of place, and that's about 10 miles north of here on the Hudson River. And the middle photo is the view from Joan's house looking out through her amazing rolling backyard. I think it's creeping time, but Joan can correct me. And all the way out to the Hudson River. And the last photo is a picture of the Hudson River looking down toward my house, which is about 8 miles down the river. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that. 8 miles by boat. Joan has welcomed really, I imagine, not just dozens, but hundreds of people to her home. She is open and warm and is always having social gatherings of one sort or another. And let's see, how will I advance that? Did it go? Oh, let's go back. Go back. Now you're seeing both of us, which aren't they lovely, Joan, those photos? Here we go. Play that. Okay, hold on 1 second. It doesn't want to go. What I wanted to show you was a picture of Joan at her house where she has a, oh no, it's on the screen, a winter solstice bonfire. And the pictures you're going to see are of Joan building that bonfire. And as usual, Joan is at the helm of building this massive bonfire that she has every year on the winter solstice at her house. I have yet to participate in this event. I'm dying to do it. But those are my friends Leslie and John with her. And as you can see, Joan and her rake are at the helm building this bonfire. And it's just, I think, one of the things that sort of illustrates how lovely and open Joan has always been and continues to be, not just with her contemporaries, but with all the way down the line to young students today, and she's such an inspiration that way. Now I want to go to the next slide, and I still can't do it. Sorry, I've never been so lame at the PowerPoint. Joan will tell me this is why I should never do PowerPoint again. So selfishly, I love going to Joan's house by myself for breakfast because I get Joan all to myself. And occasionally we do some gardening, but much of the time we will just sit and eat breakfast. And she's always got a pot of coffee ready when I get there. And the conversation literally starts whirring forward from the moment I get in the house, and it doesn't stop until I leave or Joan throws me out sometime in the early to mid-afternoon. And we start with the latest updates on sustainable food or the new non-foods that are out there. We move to recent inane political events and what's going on in the news, and we talk about parenting. We both have 2 sons. We sometimes talk about California, where we're both from, and transplanted in New York. We talk about careers as scientists, which I love hearing all about Joan's career, and on, global warming, communication, ground covers. And one day I found myself talking about paddling in the river. And I stand-up paddle here in the Hudson River, and I had just really started, and I was telling Joan about it, and about a time that I was taken down by the current. I was just swept down, and it took me an hour to get pretty far down from about 200th Street to 150th, and it took me 3 hours to get back. And I was telling Joan this story and how I had gotten back at night, and I couldn't understand the river. It's a tidal river, it's very fast, and sometimes it's fast, sometimes it's slow, and I couldn't figure it out. And Joan, just being the problem solver that she is, she's like, I've got something for you. She goes into her back room and she comes out with her tide log of the Hudson River. And this tide log is a beautiful book. They make tide charts, annual tide charts for a variety of rivers around the country, and this one was for the Hudson River. And Joan just gave it to me and said, you need this book. And it's illustrated by Escher, and every day is illustrated with the tides and the current and the ebb times and the flood times, and I am so much of a better paddler now, Joan, because of you and because I have that information. So without further ado, I just want to say being friends with Joan is one of the most cherished things I have in my life. I love you, Joan. I think you're just fantastic and amazing, and I can't wait for you to share your thoughts with this crowd today. So thank you, Joan.
Well, there's nothing to say, right? I mean, it's been done, so thank you all. Can I close this down so I can put my notes here? Yeah. Right, good. Now, I plan to say after this afternoon, one, that everything I was going to say has been said, and two, that, as I explained to Urvashi on my way in, I grew up in the 18th century, and I don't use PowerPoint. And I don't use pictures, even though 40 years ago, one of my students said, people remember 80% of what they see and 20% of what they hear. So assume that you'll only understand 20% of what you're getting from me tonight because there are no pictures, okay? I titled because I was you hearing me okay? I titled my talk, Take Nature's Side, just because I was forced to give it a title, but it's not bad. I'm really pleased here to be here this evening, experiencing the comfort of sharing space with people who are currently fighting the battle that I've been engaged in for 50 years. The battle to keep our planet, our only home, habitable for our species. And I use the word comfort here in the last sentence quite intentionally because I have been suffering so much lately from the discomfort of solastalgia, which is a wonderfully new and urgently needed word that, so far as I know, was invented about 6 years ago. Unlike nostalgia, the melancholy experienced when one is separated from a loved environment, solastalgia is the distress that afflicts people experiencing environmental loss while they're still at home. Last year, my beloved garden on the west bank of the Hudson, which you've just seen, where I've been growing much of my food for the last 25 years, has turned into a swamp and is, alas, unlikely fully to recover because the groundwater is apparently rising along with the tidal Hudson that laps the garden shore. So a tiny piece of nature that has for more than 2 decades reliably given me comfort and delight every time I look out my window can no longer do so because of the rise in sea level that all of us have helped cause. So I'm happy to be thinking about something other than my garden tonight. I'm going to talk briefly this evening about 4 things. First, a little history about pest control. Second, some thoughts about resistance, denial, as applied to plants and insects. Third, the shocking persistence of the same problems for literally decades with little apparent progress toward resolving them. And finally, what all this means in relation to the fact that we are embedded in nature. I believe I was invited to speak tonight. It feels like I'm echoing. Am I echoing terribly? Okay, fine. I think I was invited to speak tonight as one of the few people in the room likely to have been a reading adult when the landmark volume Silent Spring was published. How many of you were reading when Silent Spring was first published? I knew. See, very few. So I'd like to begin with a short quote from the anti-pesticide mother of us all, Rachel Carson. This is what she said: "Man is part of nature, and his war against nature is inevitably a war against himself." I think we can agree to forgive Carson for the outdated sexism of those man references, especially since it's pretty clear that it mostly was men who are in charge of the war against nature. And remarkably, the opposing players have not really changed in the 57 years since she wrote her brilliant cry in Nature's Defense. After Silent Spring was serialized in the New Yorker in June 19, did you all know that? You aren't old enough to know that. It came out in the New Yorker in a serial form in 1962 before the book was published. And she forecast, lost my place. After Silent Spring was serialized in the New Yorker in June 1962, American Cyanabid forecast that questioning pesticides would lead to a, quote, return to the dark ages, when, quote, insects and diseases and vermin would once again inherit the earth. And guess who? Our old friend Monsanto published and distributed a pamphlet parroting Carson's most arresting chapter about a town where all life had been silenced by the cumulative effects of DDT. Monsanto's pamphlet, entitled "The Desolate Year," described the horrors of a world devastated by famine, disease, and insects because chemical pesticides had been banned. And of course, the then Secretary of Agriculture agreed that we could never feed the world without pesticides. Does that sound familiar? An argument which remains chronically appealing, if usually misleading, since we have never fed the world. And today, when millions are hungry here and around the planet, we devote a major portion of our presumably food crops, our cropland, to corn that's fed to confined animals who should be grazing, or turned into fuel alcohol for our cars, or high fructose corn syrup for our junk foods. It has long been clear that we do not need more food to feed the world. We can now feed 10 to 11 billion people, so those 9 billion that Monsanto is always talking about is a fraud. But the hunger argument is always good for business and allows one to paint critics as cruelly indifferent to the suffering of the poor. Okay, that's my little pest control history. By the way, Jay, I have to say, I may not be optimistic tonight. I'm sorry. If that was the plan for the evening, nobody told me ahead of time, okay? Now for resistance. Prompted by this invitation to speak, I found myself thinking back to the years when I first began to understand the implications of the fact that on a finite planet, infinite growth was not possible, and that because the Earth is a globe, anything you throw over your shoulder comes up in front of you and hits you in the face. Early in my learning curve, I found a book which I actually managed to locate in my current library called Insects, Experts, and the Insecticide Crisis. Published in 1982, it has a whole section devoted to resistance and contains, among other things, the following sentence that explains the crisis of the title. Quote, "The instability of insecticidal technologies," that means the inevitable development of resistance, plus the fear of environmental contamination were the primary problems debated from 1950s through the 1970s. That sentence says that way back in the 1950s, over 60 years ago, the purveyors of a post-World War II arsenal of novel, pest-killing chemicals knew that resistance to those chemicals would occur, so that farmers who became dependent on any single product would regularly need to shift to something new. They also knew, now that Carson had pointed it out, that the poisons with which we were trying to exterminate everything we viewed as threatening to us or to our crops were working their way up the food chain that we sat on top of, poisoning on their way lots of other things in the environment besides the particular pest being targeted. It's important to keep in mind that at the time the book was published, almost 40 years ago, lots of non-chemical approaches to controlling crop pests had been familiar to professionals for decades. Among them, the development of insect-resistant strains of crops, insect pathogens, biological control, sterile males, hormonal control of insect growth, alteration of farming practices, organic production, for example, mechanical devices, the use of resistant crop plants, and so on. But only chemicals had the backing of profitability behind them, and they were modern. But something even more modern was even then on the horizon. In June of 1982, the same year the book on the insecticide crisis was published, the House Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight of the Committee on Science and Technology held a hearing on, quote, potential application of recombinant DNA and genetics on agricultural sciences. So the biotech race was on. Biotech was insistently touted at its introduction as a solution to the problems of too much pesticide use on plants because they were going to build resistance into the plants. Well, we all know how that turned out. Plants were engineered to resist insect pests, and pesticide use did initially go down. But Monsanto also engineered corn, cotton, and soy to resist a weed-killing chemical called glyphosate formulated into an herbicide called Roundup, which was touted as a miracle method of weed control. The adoption rate of this new miracle was touted as was phenomenal. The percentage of U.S. crop acreage planted to Roundup-ready corn, cotton, and soy went from 0 in 1996 to 90%. That's the percent of acreage involved in genetically engineered crops. 20 years later, it was 90%. Herbicide use went through the ceiling. By that time, just as many observers had predicted, superweeds, untouchable by the herbicide, had invaded more than half of U.S. farms. It looked like it was time to try another approach. Right? Wrong. Monsanto, slipping out from under its increasingly damned reputation, folded into Bayer, which introduced 2 new genetically stacked versions of soy, one resistant to both glyphosate and an older, more toxic pesticide called 2,4-D, and another resistant to a truly lethal old pesticide called dicamba. Dicamba-resistant soy was widely planted almost immediately, and because the pesticide is extremely volatile and moves off to places where it isn't sprayed, we've already seen a picture of what happens to peach trees. Dicamba has already caused widespread damage in surrounding fields and backyards to fruits, vegetables, commercial and residential gardens and trees, including orchard trees. It has put some farmers out of business, and others have been forced to buy dicamba-resistant seed because they can't afford to risk losing their soybean crop and by planting the variety that they really want to, which is a wonderful marketing method. But of course, resistance inevitably arises to these new fixes. We already have farmland everywhere infested with weeds like the giant palmer amaranth that has appeared in Roundup-resistant fields, a weed so huge that the only control is to send in workers to chop it down. So it should, alas, be no surprise that just about a month ago, a palmer amaranth weed resistant to both 2,4-D and dicamba was reported in a field at Kansas State University. All of which is to say that our agriculture is more deeply trapped in a chemical web than we were before GMOs were invented as a solution. And it wasn't as if no one knew. As Iowa State University's 2012 herbicide guide for Iowa corn and soybean production stated, quote, "History has proven time and time again that herbicide-based weed management will inevitably fail." That's in the Iowa State University guide. So much for the denial of resistance. Now I'd like to move on to an example of how our regulatory approach to what is killing the planet so vividly illustrates the definition of insanity to attempt to solve a problem doing exactly what one did before. And since I've been paying attention to bee survival for decades, that's the problem I'd like to speak to. In a book published 40-odd years ago, I wrote the following bee story, trying to explain how everything is connected. Quote, this is a quote, "Some time ago, a method was developed of encapsulating a highly toxic pesticide, parathion, in a time-release capsule. No pesticide was released as long as it was in solution, as it was while being applied. Only when the capsule got onto the plant and dried off was the pesticide released. This was very good for the agricultural workers. Unfortunately for the bees, the capsules turned out to be about the same size as pollen grains, so they adhered to foraging bees who carried them back to the hives and promptly wiped them out. When a local specialist was contacted by the bee owners, his memorable comment was that the bees were trespassing on the sprayed orchards." I went on. This is still from my 40-year-old book. "Teaching a bee not to trespass surely presents a significant technological challenge. With any luck, we will meet that challenge before the bees are wiped out. But we had better hurry. Pesticide accidents have already caused a striking loss in bee colonies throughout the country, and especially in California. And bees, as those of us who remember our sex education will recall, are still required to fertilize everything from almond orchards to hybrid soybeans." So that was 40 years ago. Because I'm a born optimist, I keep imagining that my fellow humans will learn not to continue doing things that are demonstrably stupid. So for some years after I read the story about encapsulated pesticides, I assumed that the comment about trespassing bees was merely one person's casually bizarre opinion. But as it so often does, reality exceeded my wildest expectations. 10 years later, the Maryland Pesticide Applicators Manual contained the following helpful information. Quote, "If bees in hives are killed as the result of drift, the applicator is held legally responsible and often must pay damages. If bees contacted the pesticide in sprayed fields, the applicator usually is not liable. The courts have ruled that the bee is trespassing and that the land does not need to be safe for uninvited animals." When I told that story to my older son, he said with delicious irony, "Well, Mom, if animals have rights, they also have responsibilities. You can't let bees be irresponsible." Then we laughingly made up a new product slogan, "This honey comes from responsible bees." We're now 20 years beyond that, and among those paying attention, there's a widespread conviction that one major threat to bees is a collection of pesticides called neonicotinoids. I knew I would not be able to get this pronunciation right, so I even broke it up. Neonicotinoids, neonics for short, that are applied to seeds before planting. One of the advantages of having lived a long time is that you have odd records going back a while. I happen to have, for reasons I don't now recall, an Iowa State flyer on integrated crop management dated May 3rd, 2004, reporting on 3 new pesticides, neonics, due to be issued that used to be used that year on Iowa crops. I have highlighted one paragraph. It says the following: neonicotinoids must be classified as highly toxic to honeybees. This is the flyer promoting the use of these things that are just coming out. It's followed by the meant-to-be reassuring sentence, however, studies on toxicity exposure indicate that it is very unlikely that honeybees will die when the product is applied to seeds. Very unlikely, perhaps, but colony collapse disorder began 2 years later. And 15 years later, the bees are doing miserably. Neonics, 5 are currently up for EPA review, have raised sufficient alarm globally that the European Union has banned them on the grounds that they're dangerous to honeybees. But we haven't banned them. And I keep getting email alerts about kicking neonic-coated seeds out of the system. Many of us have been working on kicking neonic-coated seeds out of the system for what seems like forever. Why are they still there? If I need to, I'll give the answer: money and the influence it has on politicians and regulators. Okay, we're nearing the end. When I was asked to come speak to you, I said that the only thing I could really produce for tonight was a scream of rage, because as all the foregoing demonstrates, the notion that dangerous chemicals are regulated and we're all protected is a lie. I feel terrible because I feel like I'm going to put out of business those wonderful scientists who are busy still working on this stuff, and I'm about to say that it's pointless, so forgive me. I'm not trying to put you out of a job. The notion that dangerous chemicals, as the foregoing illustrates, the notion that dangerous chemicals are regulated and that we're all protected is a lie. We in nature are the losers, and the ongoing winners are the producers of profitable chemicals, industrial, agriculture, medical, who can keep dangerous chemicals on the market for years. If you watch the struggle to regulate one pesticide after the other over as many decades as I have, you come to realize that regulation is simply not working and never has. There are too many thousands of untested chemicals out there. The financial, political, and propaganda power of the giant companies that make them is too great, and our science is way too limited to evaluate them, even if we had enough decades and the hundreds of millions of mice to begin testing them, or rats, whatever you want to test them on. The day after the election of 2016, I had to go in and teach my class at Columbia, knowing that the great majority of our students, almost all of them women, were going to be devastated by the outcome. I decided I needed to diffuse the issue. They had just been studying topics like food safety, biotech, the fallouts from industrial agriculture, and so on. So I opened the mostly female class by saying I realized most of them had hoped for a woman president, but that I was going to introduce a different issue. You've been learning, I remember I'm a teacher, so I'm not supposed to have an opinion, right? You've been learning, I reminded them, how bad the present situation is regarding the regulation of dangerous chemicals. We want you to break into groups and discuss among yourselves. Do you think Trump can make things worse? I don't remember how it all came out. There was much too much angst in that classroom, but more than 2 years later, I have an answer to that question. Yes, Trump could make things worse, and he's busy doing so. Bad as things were before, Trump's collection of corporate lobbyists turned agency administrators are busy trying their best to make things worse, stopping the ban on the clearly toxic chlorpyrifos, giving emergency approvals to dump sulfoxaflor, an insecticide the agency itself considers very highly toxic to bees, onto more than 16 million acres of bee-attractive crops, and proposing just the other day to allow the use of the dangerously volatile dicamba on corn as well as on soy, which means that a terrifying new proportion of U.S. cropland and its surroundings will be doused with this admittedly toxic chemical. But it doesn't really matter, because even if the coal industry lobbyists now in charge of the EPA gave a damn about protecting you, the available science would give him no rational way to do so. Back in that year I keep bringing up, I served on the Diet, Nutrition, and Cancer panel of the National Academy of Sciences and was asked to write a section of our report called The Role of Non-Nutritive Dietary Constituents. The section began by enumerating all the official additives, all the colors, plus all the colors, flavoring agents, grass substances, and other things allowed to be added to food that were called something other than additives. And then it went on to unintentional additives. The paragraph on contaminants that followed began with this sentence. It is estimated that approximately 12,000 substances, all of them totally untested, 12,000 substances are introduced unintentionally during processing, and an unknown number of other contaminants are inadvertently added to the food supply. This includes residues of permitted pesticides and of drugs given to animals. The section on exposure that follows remarks that exposure is impossible to estimate, and a final section called Assessment of Effects on Human Health concludes that, quote, lack of adequate data on a large number of substances precludes a comprehensive assessment of the risk to humans exposed to food additives and contaminants. That was 1982. If you imagine that things have gotten simpler in the intervening decades, then you just haven't been paying attention. In a relatively recent one of his brilliant essays, Dr. Jonathan Latham, publisher of Independent Science News, brilliantly made the case for the fact that chemical risk assessment simply doesn't work. I recommend you look it up because I won't take the time to replicate it, but he concludes that the most basic element of chemical risk assessment is scientifically invalid, since, as he writes, the elementary experiments performed by toxicologists are incapable of generating predictions of safety that can usefully be applied to other species, or even the same species, when it exists in other environments, or if it eats other diets. Risk assessment, he goes on, is not a reality, it is a complex illusion. And he notes that when one of the bad guys is, after endless hearings, reviews and the like, finally banned, another chemical about which we have no data because it hasn't been used long enough is substituted, and we're reassured that everything is fine for the time being. So what should we do, Latham goes on to ask? What would an effective grassroots strategy for the protection of people and ecosystems from toxic exposures look like? Here he makes a number of deliciously radical suggestions, among which is that we should simply dismantle a culpable regulatory agency such as the EPA, or we should make chemical homicide a statutory crime. There are many more. But how, he ultimately asks, can such goals be achieved given the finances and politics of our age? Obviously they can. So the question with which we all need to grapple is what we can do about this mess that threatens not just our species, but the living world. First, of course, we need to face up to the reality that what we're doing isn't working and isn't likely to. Next, we need to stop getting fixated on specific chemicals, on the bad guys, since we can't eliminate them one by one within the lifetime of any of us, or our children, or their children. Therefore, our energy and our political efforts should be focused on phasing out all pesticides, period. I recently heard that some such movement was seriously beginning in Europe, so the idea is not off the global table. Fourth, we need to encourage and support agricultural systems, organic, sustainable, regenerative, agroecological, that have demonstrably produced bounty without toxics, thus eliminating the major market for these chemicals. Finally, to protect ourselves in the present, we need to seek out minimally processed foods produced without such poisons. Certified organic is still our best option where it's financially possible, opting for the greatest possible variety to spread our risk whenever safety cannot be assumed. And so to close, given the pace of global warming, it may well be that preponderance of the Earth's living creatures will be wiped out by climate change before they are killed by the chemicals we are dousing them with. I'm sure I don't need to remind you of the 90% decline in monarchs, the 87% decline in rusty-patched bumblebees, and probable declines at the same scale among the rest of the insects, leading serious scientists to warn of an insect Armageddon. These deaths are simply the latest visible consequences of our war against nature. And of course, without insects, we will all die. In Rachel Carson's words, our war against nature is a war against ourselves. So we need, if only selfishly, on behalf of our own species to do everything in our power to end the chemical onslaught. Thank you.
So, Joan, thank you for being optimistic. We couldn't let this night pass without giving you our award. This is our Dragonfly Award.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. So I want to read to everybody what this says because I hope it captures Joan's organic life, which is the name of her book out there, and she'll be signing these books later. It says, for tireless educating and advocating for a society that values a healthy food system and functions in harmony with nature. Does that capture?
That's lovely.
Yeah.
That's lovely. Thank you, Jen. Thank you very much.
Let's take a picture here. Step in the middle.